On the morning of December 19th, 1976, in Dodge County, Wisconsin, a man named Phil Nessler stood in his equipment showroom and listened to his telephone ring without stopping. The ice storm had started the night before. Not snow, ice, freezing rain that had come down steadily for 14 hours and coated every power line in the county in a quarter-inch of clear glass. By dawn, the lines were starting to come down. By 8 in the morning, half of Dodge County had no electricity. For most people, a power outage in December meant cold houses and dark kitchens and the inconvenience of waiting for the utility crew to arrive. For a dairy farmer in Dodge County, it meant something different. A dairy herd does not stop producing milk because the power is out. The milking still happens morning and evening. The milk still comes. And without electricity, the bulk refrigeration tanks that kept that milk cold, the same tanks Phil had sold to most of the county's dairy operations over the past 12 years, were warming up. Slowly at first, then faster as the hours went on. By 10 in the morning, Phil's phone had not stopped ringing for 2 hours. His accounts were calling one after another with the same message. The tank is warming. What do I do? The co-op truck is coming tomorrow, and I do not know if my milk is going to pass temperature. Phil did not have a good answer. He had sold those tanks. He had financed those tanks. He had told every farmer in the county that a modern bulk refrigeration tank was the only way to run a dairy operation in 1976. He had been right about that, right up until the morning the power went out and stayed out. The National Weather Service would later record the ice storm of December 1976 as the most severe to hit south-central Wisconsin in 40 years. Power outages lasted 3 to 4 days across the county. Before it was over, the Dodge County Dairy Co-op would reject more than 2 million pounds of milk from farms across the region. Milk that had warmed past safe temperature during the outage and could not be sold for human consumption. And 3 miles up the township road from Phil Nessler's showroom, a 69-year-old dairy farmer named Leonard Grubb was carrying milk from his barn to his grandfather's spring room in 10-gallon cans, exactly the way he had done every morning and evening for the last 40 years, exactly the way his grandfather had done before him. And the milk was cold. Let me tell you about Leonard Grubb, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he kept. Leonard was born in 1907 on the same farm his grandfather Otto had homesteaded in Dodge County in 1881. The farm was 160 acres of good Wisconsin ground, rolling hills with solid drainage, a small creek along the south fence line, and on the north side of the barn where the land dipped toward a limestone shelf, a natural spring that pushed cold water out of the ground at a steady 52 degrees year-round. Summer or winter, drought or flood, the spring ran at 52 degrees. The limestone filtered it clean, and the pressure never changed. Otto Grubb had built his dairy operation around that spring in 1908, the year Leonard's father Walter was born. Before that, Otto had been keeping milk cold with ice storage, cutting blocks from the creek in January, packing them in sawdust in the ice house, using them through the summer before the co-op truck came. It worked, but it depended on cold winters and dry summers and a great deal of labor. When the winter of 1906 came in warm and the creek never froze hard enough to cut, Otto had a dairy operation with no ice going into summer and no reliable way to keep his milk cold. He spent that spring thinking. He walked the property the way a man walks land he is responsible for, with the specific attention of someone who needs it to give him something. He had always known about the spring. He had watered cattle there. He had drunk from it on hot afternoons. But that spring, watching it run in May when everything else was drying, he started thinking about what 52 degrees meant to a dairy farm. 52 degrees is not cold enough for long-term milk storage by itself. The standard requirement, even in 1908, was to get milk below 50 degrees within 2 hours of milking to slow bacterial growth. But 52 was close. And if you pre-cooled the milk first, ran it through the cold spring water before it went into any kind of storage, you could drop the temperature of fresh milk, which comes out of a cow at about 101 degrees, down to somewhere near 55 or 56 degrees within minutes. Then a modest amount of ice could bring it the rest of the way. Instead of needing to chill 101-degree milk all the way down with ice, you only needed to chill 56-degree milk the remaining few degrees. Otto built the cooling room that fall of 1908. He dug into the limestone hillside beside the spring, using the natural rock formation as the north wall and the floor. He built timber walls on 3 sides, thick walls packed with sawdust insulation, and a heavy door that sealed with a wooden bar. He ran the spring water through the room in a stone trough, kept it flowing continuously so the temperature never changed. He built wooden racks where 10-gallon milk cans could sit in the flowing water, each can surrounded by the cold spring flow. The room could hold 12 10-gallon cans at once. The spring water brought the milk temperature down from 101 degrees to 55 degrees in about 40 minutes. A modest amount of block ice, which Otto now only needed in small quantities, brought it the rest of the way to 45 degrees for storage. The co-op required 50 degrees or below. Otto was consistently delivering milk below 48. He built the room for $140 in lumber, hardware, and his own labor. He never bought another piece of refrigeration equipment in his life. Otto passed the spring room to Walter, who passed it to Leonard. Each generation maintained it the way Otto built it. The trough cleaned twice a year. The door rehung when the wood warped. The spring channel cleared of sediment each spring. Leonard had been carrying milk cans to that room since he was 8 years old. By 1976, he had done it more than 25,000 times. He had never once had a load of milk rejected by the co-op. Now, let me tell you about Phil Nessler, because you need to understand what he was selling before you can understand what he was missing. Phil had taken over his father's John Deere and equipment dealership in Watertown in 1961 at the age of 32. The dealership had been selling farm equipment since 1934, and Phil had grown up in it, learning the business from his father the way farm kids learn things, by watching and doing and eventually taking over. He was good at it. He understood machinery, he understood financing, he understood what a farmer needed to hear to make a decision he was already half convinced to make. In 1962, Phil added a line of bulk milk refrigeration tanks to his dealership. The tanks were good equipment. Stainless steel, automatic agitation, electric compressor cooling that kept milk at 38 degrees without any manual work. A farmer who switched from can milking to a bulk tank could eliminate hours of daily labor. The co-op paid a premium for bulk milk. The economics were straightforward, and Phil knew how to lay them out. He sold 47 bulk tanks in Dodge County between 1962 and 1976. He financed most of them. By 1976, Leonard Grubb was the only dairy farmer in the county still running a can operation with a spring cooling room. The last one. Phil had gotten everyone else. He had tried to get Leonard in the spring of 1965. He had driven out to the Grubb farm with his catalog and his financing sheet and found Leonard in the barn, cleaning a milking machine by hand after morning milking. Phil had laid the specs out on the hood of his truck. The numbers were good. The financing was reasonable. He had made this argument 46 times before, with 46 successful results. Leonard looked at the catalog for a moment. Then he looked at Phil. "How long has that spring been running?" Phil asked, trying to find common ground. "Since before my grandfather built on it," Leonard said. "Since before anyone alive today was born." Phil nodded. "And how much of your time does it take every day? Carrying those cans, cooling them down?" "About 40 minutes, morning and evening. Our bulk tank does it automatically." Phil gestured at the catalog. "You could get that time back every single day." Leonard considered this. "What happens when the power goes out?" Phil laughed. The good-natured laugh he used when an older farmer raised an objection he had heard before and already knew how to answer. "It is 1965, Leonard. Power goes out for a few hours, maybe a day. You have got enough temperature reserve in a properly cooled tank to handle that." Leonard looked at the barn wall behind Phil. "My grandfather built that cooling room because he could not depend on ice. He built it so the cold was always there whether he could get to the store or not, whether the weather helped him or not." He paused. "The spring does not need power. It does not need ice. It does not need anything except gravity and the temperature of the earth." Phil had heard this kind of answer before. Old farmers, old methods, the kind of resistance that usually broke down in the second or third visit when the numbers became undeniable. He had gotten past it 46 times. He did not get past it with Leonard. "That room is 57 years old," Leonard said. "It has never failed to keep my milk cold." He looked at Phil. "How old is your refrigeration technology?" Phil started to answer. "Come back when it has been here 57 years, Leonard said. "Then we can compare notes." Phil drove back to Watertown and made a note in his account book. Grubb, Leonard, resistant, spring setup. Try again next year. He never made the sale. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever kept something old not because you were afraid of the new, but because you had watched the old thing work through every kind of year for as long as you could remember, and you trusted that record more than any salesman's projection? Have you ever felt the specific, quiet confidence that comes from knowing something has already proven itself across a span of time that no new technology can claim? Leonard Grubb carried those milk cans to the spring room every morning and every evening without drama. He was not keeping the old system to make a point. He was keeping it because it worked, because it was paid for, because it required nothing from the power company or the equipment dealer or the bank, and because his grandfather had built it soundly enough that it had never given him a reason to change. He would find out in December of 1976 exactly what that reasoning was worth. Now, let me tell you about the ice storm, because it came without much warning and it stayed without any mercy. The National Weather Service issued a winter storm watch for south-central Wisconsin on the afternoon of December 18th. The forecast called for freezing rain, followed by snow. What arrived was 4 days of near-continuous freezing rain with almost no snow, which was in some ways worse. Snow is heavy, but it breaks off power lines and falls. Ice coats them and stays and adds weight continuously until the lines sag and then snap. By the morning of December 19th, power was out across a band running through Dodge County, Jefferson County, and parts of Waukesha County. The utility company estimated restoration in 24 to 48 hours. They were wrong by 2 days. For dairy farms, it was close to an emergency. A herd of 60 cows produces roughly 3,000 pounds of milk per day. That milk must be refrigerated within 2 hours of milking, or it begins to spoil. The co-op's quality standards required delivery temperature of 50 degrees or below, and they tested every load. Milk that came in above standard was rejected on the spot. Milk that had warmed and then recooled, even if it tested in range on a thermometer, was often rejected on bacterial count. Phil Nessler's accounts were calling him by 8 on the morning of December 19th. A bulk tank at 38 degrees with no power and 60 cows milked twice a day would warm to 50 degrees in approximately 12 to 16 hours, depending on ambient temperature and insulation. After that, it kept warming. By the second day, with barn temperatures in the low 40s, the tanks across the county were sitting at 55, 60, 65 degrees. The milk inside them was not yet sour, but it had been held at suboptimal temperature long enough that the bacterial count was rising, and the co-op inspectors were going to find it. The co-op trucks made their rounds on December 21st and 22nd. Of the 31 farms on the route, 27 had milk that failed the temperature test or the bacterial count. The rejected milk was dumped. 27 farms in Dodge County dumped between 2 and 4 days of production in December of 1976. At the prevailing price of $14 per hundredweight, a 60-cow dairy dumping 3 days of milk lost $1,260. A 100-cow operation lost over $2,000. Phil's larger accounts lost more than $3,000 in a single week. The co-op truck stopped at Leonard Grubb's farm on December 22nd. Leonard's milk had been in the spring room since the storm started. The cans sat in the stone trough with 52-degree spring water flowing around them without interruption. The temperature of the milk in the cans when the co-op driver tested it was 46 degrees. Within standard, bacterial count well within range. The driver loaded Leonard's cans onto the truck, the only milk from that stretch of road that passed that morning, and drove on. Leonard's payment that week was $318. Every farm around him received nothing. Let me tell you what that week cost Dodge County, because the numbers matter. The total losses to Dodge County dairy farmers from the December 1976 ice storm were later estimated at more than $400,000 in rejected milk. This did not count the emergency generator rental some farmers scrambled to arrange, or the disposal costs for the spoiled product, or the downstream impact on farms that had already been running close to their loan limits after a difficult fall market. Phil Nessler spent most of December 23rd and 24th on the telephone with the equipment company representative, asking questions he had not thought to ask when he was selling. Questions about backup power, about manual cooling protocols for extended outages, about what the rated temperature reserve on the tanks actually meant in a 4-day scenario versus a 12-hour one. He had not asked these questions before because the power had always come back within a day. He had been right about that probability for 14 years. He had been wrong about it being a guarantee. He drove out to Leonard's farm on the morning of December 26th. The ice was still on the trees. The roads were glazed and passable. He parked beside the barn and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. He had left his catalog on the passenger seat. He did not bring it. Leonard was at the spring room when Phil came around the north side of the barn. The heavy timber door was open, and Leonard was carrying out the morning's empty cans, setting them upside down in the cold air to drain. He looked up when Phil came around the corner, and his expression did not change. Phil stood near the spring room doorway and looked inside. The stone trough, the water running without stopping over the limestone, the wooden racks, the building his catalog had called a relic, the building Leonard's grandfather had built with $140 in lumber 68 years ago. "Your milk passed," Phil said. Leonard set the last can upside down. "It did." "The only load on this road," Phil said. "One of about 4 in the county, I heard." Phil put his hands in his coat pockets. He was wearing his good coat, the one he wore to equipment shows and bank meetings, and it looked wrong in this yard next to the old spring room door. "How cold does it keep?" "Depends on how I pack the cans. Usually 45 to 48. On spring water alone. The first 20 degrees of cooling, yes. Then a little ice if I need to push it further." He looked at Phil. "I put up about 400 pounds of ice every January from the creek. 3 days of work. Lasts the year." Phil looked at the running water in the trough. The water was completely indifferent to the ice storm, to the power outage, to the 47 tanks sitting useless and warming on 47 farms across the county. It had been this temperature before any of those farms existed, and it would be this temperature after all of them were gone. "What does it cost to run?" Phil asked. "My labor," Leonard said. "Maybe $12 a year in hardware." Phil was quiet. He was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with equipment costs. "I told you in 1965 that your 40 minutes a day was not worth it," Phil said. "You did. I was wrong about that." Leonard looked at him. "Yes, you were." Phil stepped closer to the doorway. "I sold 31 bulk tanks on this road." He paused. 27 of those farms dumped milk last week." Leonard nodded. "I know. What does it take?" Phil asked. "To build something like this?" Leonard leaned against the stone wall of the spring room and looked at the trough. "You need a spring. That is the first thing. Not every farm has one." He was quiet for a moment. "You need to understand what temperature your spring runs and whether it is cold enough to work with. You need to build around the water instead of trying to make the water fit a building." He paused. "My grandfather spent 2 springs watching the flow and measuring the temperature before he built anything. He did not touch a shovel until he knew the spring well enough to trust it." Phil looked at the stone trough. 2 springs of watching before he touched a shovel. Leonard nodded. He was not in a hurry. He had already lost 1 season to bad milk storage, and he was not going to lose another. He stood up and picked up a milk can. "You have got 14 years of data on those tanks now, Phil. You know what they cost. You know what they need." He looked at Phil. "You also know what happened last week." He carried the can back inside. "The question you should be asking your customers now is whether the system that failed is the only system worth building." Phil drove back to Watertown. He had 4 calls to return from accounts that wanted to discuss backup power options. He would answer them honestly this time, including the honest part about what backup power cost and what it added to the monthly payment on a tank that already required a monthly payment. He also made a different call that afternoon. He called the county extension office and asked which agent handled dairy facility planning. He wanted to know how many farms in the county still had natural spring sites that might support a cooling system. He was not yet sure what he would do with the information. He just thought someone should be asking the question. Let me tell you about the years after, because this story does not end with one ice storm. Leonard Grubb continued dairying with the spring room for another 12 years, until 1988, when his hips made the twice-daily can carrying difficult enough that the work outpaced him. He was 81 years old. He sold the dairy herd that spring, 32 head of good Holstein stock, and leased the cropland to a neighbor. He did not sell the spring room. He had it inspected and repaired where the timber had softened, replaced the door, cleared the trough, and told his son Gerald that the room was to be kept up whether anyone used it or not. Because someone might need it, Leonard said. And if that day comes, I want it ready. Phil Nessler sold his dealership in 1983. His son took it over. Phil spent the last years of his working life doing something that would have surprised the younger version of himself. He visited old farms across Dodge County that still had spring houses, root cellars, hand-dug wells, and ice rooms. He photographed them. He wrote down how they were built, what materials they used, how the drainage worked, what the flow rates were. He gave copies of his notes to the County Historical Society and to the Extension Office. A reporter from the county paper asked him once why he had started doing this. Phil looked at him. Because I spent 20 years telling farmers that their grandfathers' methods were obsolete, he said, and then one week in December showed me that what I called obsolete was the only thing that worked when everything modern failed at once. He paused. I figured someone ought to write it down before the last people who knew how it worked were gone. Let me tell you about 1993, because that is where this story closes the circle it opened. Gerald Grubb, Leonard's son, was 52 years old in the summer of 1993. He had managed the farm since Leonard's retirement, maintaining the buildings, the crop acres, the old equipment his father had kept running. He had not brought back the dairy herd. Small-scale dairying in Wisconsin in the early 90s was difficult, and Gerald knew it. But he had maintained the spring room, the way Leonard told him to. In August of 1993, a young couple named Matt and Sarah Hollenbeck bought the 80 acres adjoining the Grubb farm. They were 28 and 26, recently married, planning to start a small organic dairy operation. They had heard there was a natural spring on the neighboring property. They knocked on Gerald's door to ask about it. Gerald walked them through the spring room the way Leonard had walked Phil Nessler through it 17 years earlier. He showed them the stone trough, the flow rate, the temperature. He explained what Otto had built in 1908 and why, and how it had worked across 3 generations without a single power bill. Matt crouched in the doorway and ran his hand through the running water. How much would it cost to build something like this? Gerald thought about it. Materials, maybe $300 or $400 today. He paused. The hard part is not the building. The hard part is spending the time to understand your spring before you build around it. My grandfather spent 2 springs watching, before he touched a shovel. Matt looked at the water moving over the limestone. 2 springs, he said. He looked at Sarah. Sarah was writing in a small notebook. They built their cooling room that fall. Gerald helped them. The spring on the Hollenbeck property ran at 51 degrees, 1 degree cooler than the Grubb spring. Their room was slightly different in its trough design. Matt had done some reading and modified the geometry, but the principle was identical to what Otto had laid out in 1908. The Hollenbeck Dairy has been in operation for 30 years. They have never installed a bulk refrigeration tank. Their milk has never been rejected by the co-op. Let me tell you the final thing, because it is the thing Leonard would have wanted you to know. The spring room at the Grubb farm is still standing. Gerald's daughter farms the property now, and she maintains the room the way every generation before her has maintained it. The stone trough cleared each spring. The door hung true. The water running at the same temperature it has run for longer than anyone alive can remember. It has never needed a power line. It has never needed a service call. It has never needed a compressor replaced or a thermostat calibrated or a loan renewed at the bank. It has never failed during a power outage because it does not depend on power. It has never failed during an ice storm because ice storms are nothing to a spring that comes out of the ground at 52 degrees regardless of what the weather decides to do above it. Phil Nessler's bulk tanks are in scrap yards now, most of them. The company updated its models through the 80s and 90s, and the old versions were phased out or retired when operations closed. The financing Phil arranged for those tanks is long paid off for the farms that survived to pay it. The stone trough Otto Grubb built in 1908 is still running. The spring water moving through it is the same temperature it has always been. The milk it keeps cold is still passing the co-op test. The equipment dealers said Otto's cooling room was behind the times. They said Leonard was wasting 40 minutes a day. They said the spring room was a relic from the era before electricity made such things unnecessary. They were right that electricity made such things unnecessary right up until the electricity went away. Leonard Grubb never argued that old was always better. He argued that a method which had worked for 60 years through every kind of weather and every kind of year deserved more respect than a method that had worked for 6. He argued that when a salesman told you something was obsolete, the honest question was obsolete compared to what, by whose measure, and in what kind of year. He found out in December of 1976 what kind of year would answer that question. He had known his answer before anyone asked it. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the farmers who built things that did not depend on anyone else's infrastructure, who understood that the most reliable technology is the technology that has the fewest parts to fail, who kept the old knowledge running not because they were afraid of the new, but because they had watched the old work long enough to understand what it was worth. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, did your family farm have a spring house, a root cellar, an ice house? Something the land itself provided that no power bill could replicate? I would like to hear about it. The spring is still running. The water is still 52 degrees. The milk is still cold. Some things are not improved by being made more complicated. They are only made more fragile.